Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the launch of the exhibition entitled Our Shared Humanity in Action, which focuses on the role played by the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid in dismantling apartheid in South Africa. My name is Sophia Deker, and I'll be your program director this evening. Before we proceed with our program, I would like to outline some housekeeping rules. As you can see over the screen there, if you could please switch off your cell phones or put them on airplane mode so that there's no interference with the sound, we would really appreciate that. And also be mindful of the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an amazing lineup of speakers tonight, so sit back, relax, and take it all in. To kickstart the program, I would like to invite the Chief Executive of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, to do the official welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. Let me start by welcoming all ambassadors here present, diplomatic staff who have joined us this evening, board members of the Nelson Mandela Foundation who are with us this evening. Thank you for joining us. And also, let me welcome the speakers who will be speaking this evening. Dr. Naledi Pandor, the chair of our board, Ambassador Abdul Minty, who will also be introduced. All the speakers will be introduced more fully later. Mr. Nelson Mufu, as well as Zahir Laher. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Potelwa, the chairperson of the Nelson Mandela Museum, a partner organization in the Eastern Cape. This evening, this exhibition we're opening is in part picking up on the theme of the annual lecture of this year. The 22nd Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture was also about realizing our shared humanity. In the context we're in, with the kinds of conflicts that are going on in the world, I think it is important that we remind the world of how South Africa, in its own hour of need, gained support from people who stood up around the world, from people who put pressure on institutions around the world to do something about apartheid in South Africa. On our shared humanity, and in this moment that we're in today, I want to just quote from the 22nd annual lecture by Professor Abdul Razak Gurna. He said, and I quote, "For a while in those years in the early 1960s, when some of us were just coming into knowledge of the racist hegemony that was in control of the southern regions of Africa, it did not seem possible that such powerful and mean-spirited domination could end. Just as now, when we watch and read about the destruction and deaths in Gaza, it seems impossible to imagine how the injustice will end." He continued to say, "Day after day, we hear and watch the atrocities taking place in Gaza. And many thousands across the world express in what ways they can their disgust and pain at this continuing slaughter. Yet it seems that Israel's leaders are not yet done with their aims in Gaza. In this respect, I applaud the actions of the South African government to take the case of Gaza to the International Court of Justice and to invite even greater condemnation of these tragic events. The court's ruling and its warrants will only be more words in the end, and words will not end this or other injustices, will not rebuild schools or hospitals, or end detentions and the destruction of cities. But there are times when words is all we have. Words and sympathy, and an understanding of our comparable experiences, our shared humanity." And here our shared humanity is indeed about reminding us of the work that was done by the UN Anti-Apartheid or UN Committee Against Apartheid, that it is possible when all we have words, as Gordner says, that memory, in addition to those words, can help us in this moment to think about ways to search for justice, to work towards justice in the world. And lastly, just to touch on the exhibition briefly, the exhibition is both a physical and an audiovisual, and has an audiovisual dimension as well. The exhibition boards that you saw as you walked in, on which you can view information on the committee, and this is complemented with an audiovisual component. The audiovisual component will be shown a bit later in this program. The exhibition will be available at the foundation until the end of March 2020, and it is free to view. And so with those words, I want to again welcome you to the foundation and thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Dr. Buthelezi. Now that you have been welcomed, if you can please indulge me, can I ask everyone in the room to please turn to the person next to you, in front of you, or behind you, and introduce yourself. On the condition that it must be someone that you don't already know. Okay, so to continue with the program, I would now like to invite Head of the Dialogue and Advocacy Team here at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Dr. Sumaya Hendricks, who is going to take us through some background of the exhibition.
Because Moeseni makes me work so hard, I've lost my voice. So you're all going to have to just bear with me. But thanks so much, Sophia, and I'm grateful to be in the space with all of you this evening. In his book, The Message, Ta-Nehisi Coates speaks about how it is never enough for the reader to merely be convinced with words. They must be haunted. They must be haunted by your words to such an extent that they think about it before they go to bed, that they want to tell their partner about it when they wake up in the morning, and that they even feel compelled to grab random people on the streets to ask them, have you read it? Now, this really got me thinking about what should be the purpose of an exhibition that uses words, drawing on the archives to convey a message and messages. While we hope the exhibition haunts people to such an extent that you feel compelled to grab people, gently grab people in the streets and say, have you seen it yet? Our hope is that it does a bit more than this, and that it also inspires people and moves people to action in service of something good. Now, while developing exhibitions is part and parcel of the work that Razia's team, the archives and research team often does at the foundation, it's the first time that my team worked collaboratively on an exhibition. I'm glad we were somewhat naive about the work that it entailed, because I think we might have been somewhat discouraged to embark on this journey. But it really has been a labor of love, because it really gave us an opportunity to delve into archival resources and in history in such an intimate way, and in a way that really benefits our work. And so I thought I'd really just use these few minutes to share with you, having gone through all of this archives, 3 takeaways that I think that might be beneficial. The first one is around awareness building. Now, while the committee was originally tasked with disseminating information on apartheid, over time, their role evolved to play a more advocacy role and to promote the anti-apartheid campaign. And this is also reflected in the name change of the committee. So at the beginning, we had quite a long name. It was the Special Committee on the Policies of Apartheid of the Government of the Republic of South Africa. And it later changed to the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. But this initial phase of awareness building and building consciousness, it was really important because people needed to know about the evils of apartheid. And I think in here is a lesson because it's such an important step that can easily be missed. And while on some issues, there isn't necessarily a need to create awareness, on other issues, we do need that time and resources where we invest in just creating awareness and doing that awareness building. The second lesson was about being an activist in whatever space you find yourselves in. My team and I were always inspired about the diplomats such as E.S. Reddy, Ambassador Abdul Munti that's here this evening, that really worked for change. And it really reminds us that whatever space we find ourselves in, we have to ask the question of how do I add value to the space that I am in? And that's something that should be top in mind. And we can be an activist in whatever space we find ourselves in, and especially in a country like South Africa. You cannot just be an accountant. You have to be an activist accountant. You can't merely be an academic. You need to be an activist academic. You cannot merely be a lawyer. You need to be an activist lawyer. And the last thing I want to share with you is about the importance of diversity in the solidarity landscape. Now, the committee was well aware of its limitations because ultimately it operated in an institution that has its limitations. And E.S. Reddy, who was the Indian diplomat that I spoke to earlier, was acutely aware of this, and he spoke about how the committee realized that they needed to help promote the establishments of funds and agencies outside of the committee, because ultimately they were able to do things that the UN, that the committee and UN organs could not do. And now we are all part of institutions and formations that has these limitations. And so what might be easier for some institutions and formations might be harder for others. And so it really reinforces the lessons of working together and about the beauty and the importance of having a diverse solidarity landscape and leveraging the different actors within the landscape. So those are the three lessons I want to share with you. The importance of awareness building, being an activist in whatever space you find yourself in, and building a diverse solidarity landscape and leveraging that diversity. To conclude, I want to make special mention of my team that's really worked hard on the exhibition and also on this event this evening. Some of them are in this room. If you're not in this room, it's fine, but if you are, please raise your hand. Samantha, I think she might still be up front. Norma, where are you? Taylor, who you're going to just hear from just now. And Lutfia, who's all the way at the back there. Thank you for helping make this project a reality. In each of you, I see a willingness to realize our shared humanity, and I'm really grateful to be part of the team. So thank you all for listening. I really hope that you leave here tonight feeling haunted, inspired, and moved to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for sharing those powerful lessons with us. And we really appreciate you coming through tonight, given that you're not feeling well. We do appreciate that. Now I would like to invite Taylor Johnson, who did research on the exhibition and helped make the exhibition a reality, so that she can give us an overview of the exhibition. Ladies and gentlemen, Taylor Johnson.
I always hate speaking up to Samir. She's such a tough act to follow. But good evening, everyone. All protocol observed, and welcome to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I've been tasked with giving you a brief overview of a project that has been so integral to my time at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Over the last few months, this exhibition entitled Our Shared Humanity in Action, a reflection of the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid, took many hours, many working documents, many revisions and versions, and many of Sumair's questions kind of going along the lines of, Taylor, are you absolutely sure that this is the exact quote that was used in the report? In terms of how it all began, we took a visit to the South African History Archive, or SAHA for short, at the University of the Witwatersrand. Saha gave us a glimpse of what the Special Committee sought to achieve during apartheid. And from that visit, we were able to explore other archives such as E.S. Reddy's JSTOR collection on the United Nations Special Committee, where we sifted through 31 reports, each being between 150 to 250 pages long. These reports were submitted to the United Nations General Assembly annually by the Special Committee. This is exclusionary of the other 38 special reports made by the committee on matters such as trade unions, sanctions, embargoes, all released within the same time frame. After reading, and yes, more reading, we really felt it necessary to incorporate an audiovisual element into this exhibition to consolidate over a decade of work in a way where you also did not have to do the tedious reading. This led us to the United Nations Audiovisual Library and the Nelson Mandela Foundation poster collection, where much of the materials obtained for our audiovisual were gained, some of which were also included in the physical exhibition boards that you engaged with outside on your arrival. Having gone through all of these archival resources, naturally we could only incorporate some of the information into the exhibition boards. The information on the boards is split into 3 sections. The first section will give you a short background to the committee and how it came about. The second section goes into detail about the committee's mandate, its membership, and the committee's actions through different periods from 1963 onward. The third section expresses failures of our shared humanity, or, as I like to put it a little bit more bluntly, what not to do when the world is falling apart. In this section, there's an overview of the countries, more specifically the United States, the United Kingdom, Israel, and France, who were all complicit in aiding the apartheid regime. This project was executed by a team of people at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It was a collaborative effort between the Dialogue and Advocacy and Archive and Research departments. The researching and consolidation efforts of the Dialogue and Advocacy team were largely complemented by the expertise and experience of the Archive and Research team, all of which helped to make this project come to life. I want to take this opportunity to thank Razia Saleh and her amazing team for assisting us in finalizing all of the iterations of this exhibition and providing us with your knowledge on curating spectacular exhibition spaces. A special mention also needs to be given to Dream Fuel for the exceptional design of the exhibition boards and for the execution of the audiovisual item. The audiovisual element of this exhibition is one that can really speak for itself. When I conclude my remarks in a minute, it will be displayed for you. But before I leave, one of the main goals of this exhibition was to depict the impact of collective humanity during times of great injustice. But there's also another hope that my team and I had when executing this project. And it aims to inspire you all to leave here today thinking about your individual humanity. To us, this means that wherever you find yourself in the world, that you really share your humanity with others. I would like to leave you with a poem written by a very special Dr. Sumaya Hendricks. She wrote it many years ago, but I stalked her on Twitter, and I found it, and I really thought it would be fitting to share with you this evening. Hold out a hand. Dear self, do not be so harsh with judgment. Their mistakes and pitfalls may be hills compared with the mountains of sin beneath your feet. Wait a while and hold out your hand. Your light may be one that guides them. Stop reveling in your achievements and ability. The pain of others may be boulders on their shoulders, weighing them down. Hold out a hand. Your kindness may chisel away their burden. Thank you for your time, and please enjoy the short documentary on the Special Committee.
Our Shared Humanity in Action, reflecting on the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. The Special Committee Against Apartheid was established by the United Nations General Assembly on the 6th of November 1962. While it was originally named the Special Committee on the Policies of Apartheid of the Government of the Republic of South Africa, the name of the committee was changed in 1975 to reflect its evolving role as an advocate against the South African apartheid government. The committee recognized that apartheid could not be reformed, but must be totally destroyed. The United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid is a demonstration of our shared humanity in action. The original committee comprised at first of 11 members from nations in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central America. The membership evolved over time and by 1980 also included India and Sudan. The committee held its first meeting in April 1963 and was disbanded in June 1994 after South Africa's first democratic elections. Western powers and South Africa's key trading partners were reluctant to join anti-apartheid efforts and did not participate in the committee, as they were often actively involved in supporting the apartheid regime. Many Western corporations carried on with a business-as-usual approach to apartheid. The committee was always chaired by an African, with mainly Nigerian leadership, but also included Guinean and Somalian leadership. In 1964, activist and singer Maria Makeba addressed the committee stating,
"The members of the committee also know that every time we tried to better the situation, the Verwoerd government went further to make South Africa a nightmare to the Africans through police brutality and government terrorism. The story of the shootings at Sharpeville is well known throughout the world. Indeed, all men and women of goodwill all over the world raised their voices in anger on that occasion, but all these protests just fell on deaf ears. Indeed, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members, my country has been turned by the Verwoerd government into a huge prison. I feel certain that the time has come for the whole of humanity to shout halt and to act with firmness to stop these crazy rulers from dragging our country into a horrifying disaster. Thank you."
In the first decade after its inception, the committee strategically initiated international outreach and expanded its presence across countries. In 1974, the committee played a crucial role in the adoption of the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid by the UN General Assembly. According to the convention, apartheid is a crime against humanity, and that inhuman acts resulting from the policies and practices of apartheid and similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination are crimes violating the principles of international law. Organizations, institutions, and individuals involved in apartheid are deemed criminal. The committee lobbied member states, promoted campaigns, and provided support to the liberation movement in South Africa. It monitored the impact of apartheid in Southern Africa and encouraged information dissemination on the evils of apartheid through different channels such as film. The committee reported not only on examples of collaboration with the apartheid state, but also examples of countries and formations playing their part in the elimination of apartheid. In this regard, examples of our shared humanity in action included: Peru formally pledged to deny permits to South African athletes in 1974. India was one of the first countries to impose economic and diplomatic sanctions against South Africa. In 1974, Lebanon severed relations with apartheid South Africa, including diplomatic and economic. Norway has been the largest contributor to the United Nations Trust Fund for publicity against apartheid since its inception in 1975. In 1987, 5 United States filmmakers, on behalf of 100 filmmakers, wrote to the United States President, then Ronald Reagan, urging him to fully support the cultural boycott against South Africa. The Special Committee, therefore, cannot but express its utmost regret at the policies and actions of the governments which have found common interest with the Pretoria regime and provided it comfort and encouragement in the pursuit of its crimes against Africa and against humanity. It must make special mention of the government of the United States of America and the governments of certain other Western powers, notably the United Kingdom, as well as the regime of Israel. At the 641st meeting of the Special Committee Against Apartheid, on June 22, 1990, Nelson Mandela acknowledged the role of the Special Committee and its member states.
We also take this opportunity to salute the Special Committee Against Apartheid, which has been and is a very important instrument in our struggle against the iniquitous and oppressive policies of the South African government. We salute also the states that make up its membership, who have been unrelenting in their resolve to contribute everything they could to ensure that the world was mobilized to act against the apartheid system. We also take this opportunity to extend warm greetings to all others who fight for their liberation and their human rights, including the peoples of Palestine and Western Sahara.
It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Naledi Pandor. She is the former Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa and the new chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation's board. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Dumelang Sanbonani. That's about as far as I go this evening. So since I served as a Minister of International Relations, unlike others, I cannot ignore protocol and use that very weird phrase, protocol observed. I have to say, Excellencies, ambassadors and high commissioners, senior officials of government present here today, members of the executive joining us this evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and our brand new Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Buthelezi, and all of you, welcome to this wonderful exhibition launch. I would like to begin by congratulating the Nelson Mandela Foundation for its most appropriate selection of this exhibition's subject as an accurate reflection of our shared humanity in action. Congratulations to those who made the selections of items to be displayed and the evocative memories inscribed in each selection. It is a special privilege for the Foundation to have Ambassador Abdul Minty present here, given the historic contribution he made in our struggle for freedom and the steadfast role he played as a committed activist, freedom fighter, and presenter, and intellectual contributor to the Special Committee. Many people in South Africa do not know that there is a UN convention on the suppression of and punishment of the crime of apartheid. This convention was developed to signal to the world that the global community fiercely opposed the discriminatory racial policies of the apartheid government of South Africa. There are some in our country today who say it was better under apartheid. They're saying it was better to have crimes against humanity than to have the freedom we enjoy. It's a very odd statement to my mind. You would recall that in the United Nations founding document, the United Nations Charter, in its Articles 55 and 56, we saw a direct offense by apartheid to the objectives of the Charter. We all know that regular resolutions condemning apartheid were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, and that apartheid was regularly discussed by the United Nations Security Council, particularly following the Sharpeville massacre. In 1966, apartheid was declared a crime against humanity by resolution of the General Assembly, and in 1984, the Security Council endorsed this resolution. The convention was adopted in 1973 with 91 votes in favor, 4 against, being the United Kingdom, Portugal, South Africa, and the United States of America. And there were 26 abstentions. I encourage all of you as South Africans and fellow actors for humanity to read the Convention Against the Crime of Apartheid, to get a full sense of its significance and its meaning for all humanity. I believe that this launch reflects 4 important legacies that the struggle for freedom has bequeathed to all South Africans and probably to humanity. First, the important organizational role and leadership of the liberation movements. This is a very important lesson that we should not forget. Their ideological orientation and political belief in the unity of humanity stand out as an important part of that first bequeath. Second, the strategies and tactics employed in the struggle, which I believe will definitely shape mass struggles for many, many centuries. The conceptualization in that regard of the 4 pillars of struggle, which all of us forget often: mass mobilization, underground, international sanctions and boycott, and armed struggle. These have provided a useful basis for refining strategies directed at achieving freedom. While much of the patent for these 4 pillars resides with the African National Congress, they were utilized in varying forms by all liberation organizations. They have given us the legacy of united action in service of humanity. The international dimension of our struggle and its contribution to our freedom is neglected in our political discourse. Even more worrying, its implications for our obligation to the freedom struggle of others is ignored. I became unpopular in a recent conference where I was questioning why the organization has not taken any action with respect to Israeli institutions that it has partnerships with. And one of the leading voices in that conference reminded me that I must be even-handed. And I asked the gentleman, how are you even-handed when there are human rights abuses. Surely the matters are clear when harm is perpetrated against a group. So this even-handedness is sometimes very odd. The third important lesson is the importance of international solidarity. And I think it is something we should not neglect as South Africans. We had our leaders in many, many organizational sectors in South Africa, as well as in a range of organizations, working hard to convince the world that everyone in the world had a moral obligation to assist us in combating the evil of apartheid. No foreigner was saying that on our behalf. It was our leaders asking the world to support us because there was a moral duty given the crime against humanity being perpetrated. A cursory reading of the book, and I do recommend it to you, I believe it's available in South Africa, of the book International Brigade Against Apartheid, illustrates the dedicated contribution of hundreds to the people's war that helped to liberate South Africa. Of course, all the four pillars I've referred to were important, particularly the mass struggle, but I believe it is absolutely imperative that we as South Africans acknowledge the complementary aspects of our struggle that supported us to gain freedom. The fact that millions worldwide joined our battle to be free, the inclusion of this historic solidarity in our country's Bill of Rights, and the recognition in our foreign policy that we have an honorable obligation of international commitment has shaped and influenced our foreign policy and practice, and I believe influences the exhibition we are part of launching today. Of course, complications with respect to action arise whenever morality requires practical responses. You know, even in the casual situation, that young woman you may like, it may be a complication which causes you to pause. So morality is very different when a practical response is required. But our shared humanity in action implies we need to be concerned whenever human rights are infringed and whenever the United Nations Charter provisions are breached. It should not be a question of intellectual scrutiny or examination. It should be evident that we must act. We have often failed to act, largely because we have diminished much of the armor that contributed to the progress achieved in confronting apartheid. Our expectation and definition of common action in defense of humanity appears to be that government or the governing party alone should be our human solidarity expression. The role of faith-based organizations, trade union formations, and youth organizations is sorely neglected and not often spoken of. So we have become actors expecting others to act rather than actors ourselves. So we've diminished our ability as part of a force. Current strife in the Middle East and in parts of Eastern Europe and on our own continent receives scant attention from us as members of civil society. It's thus often difficult to believe that we fully embrace the implications of our shared humanity and the powerful force that action together could mean for those suffering harm and abuse. Imagine if we just decided that as a global community, we are going to have 5 days of action in boycott and solidarity with the people of Palestine. Just 5 days. And we persuade millions throughout the world. We'll stop buying, we won't go to work, we won't offload ships. Just 5 days. Imagine the impact. But we sit in splendid isolation. Our leaders were brave men and women, brave young men and women. Our freedom, however, has, I think, made us cowardly in comfort. Hopefully, this exhibition will give us a true sense of what our oppression meant to the world and will steer us toward acting in support of struggles elsewhere in whatever manner modestly possible. I think we all know that not all action gets results, but action is required nonetheless. I believe key to our shared humanity, key to us acknowledging the importance of this exhibition, is our recognition that you matter because I recognize in action that you matter. This is what I think our guest speaker at our annual lecture was conveying to us in his lecture when he spoke of action in response to our shared humanity. I was struck during an interaction he had with our CEO. The CEO was posing a range of questions to him about his lecture. And at one point, our CEO said to him, "Professor, you made reference to the absence of democracy and civil interaction, civil action in your part of the world, and you expressed concern about it. And you appeared to believe that in South Africa, we are happy with our own situation. However, I wish to share with you that we're not entirely happy. Things are going wrong in South Africa as well. And so it's not something that you should appear to appreciate all the time." The professor's response to him, and I found it very telling, was, "Well, at least in South Africa you can say it in the open." Thank you very much.
Whew. Thank you so much, Dr. Pando, for sharing your insights with us. There was a lot to process and to take in. So we will now be moving on to having reflections on the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. And the first reflection we will have is from Ambassador Abdul Minty, who is the former Honorary Secretary of the British Anti-Apartheid Movement and Director of the World Campaign Against Military and Nuclear Collaborations with South Africa. He interacted many times with the committee, so we look forward to hearing his reflections on this.
Well, greetings to all, and thank you to the Mandela Foundation for inviting me here today. And unlike the minister, I will say all protocol observed. And it'll save me from repeating many of the things that other speakers have said, because in a few minutes' contribution, I didn't know what others were going to cover. So it's quite difficult to speak in the middle, not knowing what others would say and what you should hear. Anyway, I echo everything the minister has said, particularly about the need for us to be active on the Middle East and particularly Palestine. Friends, I don't know how many of you know that the two most famous books in the 50s about South Africa were Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton and Naught for Your Comfort by Trevor Huddleston. There are many who've probably not read it, but I implore everyone to read Trevor Huddleston's Naught for Your Comfort, not only because it's a seminal book, but because he continued to inspire the anti-apartheid movement and the international campaign for decades after he was removed by the British Church from South Africa, because he was developing into a Gandhian figure in South Africa itself. And he found it great difficulty in observing his vows of obedience, chastity, and so on, when he didn't defy the church and went to Britain. Then I think it's also useful, although many of you will have forgotten it because it's a long time ago, to read the Nobel lecture of the first African to be had the Nobel Peace Prize, Chief Albert Luthuli, whom I had the pleasure to nominate in 1960. But in 1960, they didn't award a Nobel Prize, so he got the 1961 Nobel Peace Prize. Imagine in a country like Norway, in freezing cold in December, here comes what many thought as a half-naked African, and he addressed them with so much dignity that they not only supported his call, but much later when we went there on other visits and spoke of other liberation movements, the Norwegian people said, we only know the ANC because we know Chief Luthuli. So after Chief Luthuli came Oliver Tambo. And he, in 1960, immediately after Sharpeville, was sent abroad. And he didn't know what to do except to build the international solidarity movement. And so he came to Britain. And we in Britain, I had left South Africa in 1958 as a student. And in 1960, we formed the boycott movement, or rather 1959 we formed the boycott movement so that in 1960 we would have a 1-month boycott of South African goods, just 1 month, February. And that month started with campaigns in Birmingham, in Liverpool, in Leeds and so on. So branches were set up in various schools and universities. That's where I met Mr. and Mrs. Kinnock, who were students at Swansea University. David Steele, the later leader of the Liberal Party, who was also a student. So they joined us at that time. And before that, in 1958-59, we had the Commonwealth Conference in London. And Barbara Castle, a prominent Labour MP, and I worked for a 72-hour vigil outside the Commonwealth. And there she managed to get the top playwrights and authors and public figures to come for 1 hour, but for 72 hours continuously, day and night, outside the Commonwealth Conference. And when the British Prime Minister said, I don't think that everybody is against South Africa in the Commonwealth, they pointed to the demonstrations outside. And so South Africa decided to withdraw from the Commonwealth rather than proceed with its claim under a republic to remain in the Commonwealth. We followed Dr. Verwoerd. It was the first time he visited Britain. Before that, Eric Lowe visited the Commonwealth conferences. We followed him with a coffin on a minicar, and we said, here was Sharpeville, and wherever he went, we went. In the end, he and the fascists who worked with them burned the office of the boycott movement. We lost quite a bit of money, and some people got frightened. So the Committee of African Organizations, a body of African students, got together and said they would give us an office. And so the boycott movement worked from CAO, the Committee of African Organizations. Then Sharpeville occurred. And it was as if what we were warning about had happened. And the world realized what a disastrous regime the apartheid regime was. And that weekend, Barbara Castle decided that we would have a rally in Trafalgar Square. And she chaired that rally. And she told me, we are not continuing with the boycott movement anymore because we have to destroy apartheid. And so without any committee meeting or any board meeting or any democratic decision, at that rally, we changed the name from the boycott movement to the anti-apartheid movement. And it remains so ever since, because our objective was to destroy the apartheid system. Now, the special committee was set up early in '62. When I first discussed this with Mr. Reddy, he said, "You're mad. No country has had a committee against it, ever, in the UN. How can we have it against apartheid, and the Western countries will not allow it?" So Oliver Tambo had asked me to become the secretary of the anti-apartheid movement. In 1962, I became the honorary secretary, and among the letters I wrote to the UN was that they should establish a special committee against apartheid. And we lobbied Nigeria and many African and Asian countries. Nigeria was very important in our struggle because it was the biggest country in Africa. It was very important for the West, and the West did not wish to annoy Nigeria. And that is why after the first few chairmen of the special committee, Madam Sisi and others from other African countries, we then concentrated on always getting a Nigerian as chairman of the special committee. Because if we went anywhere with the chairman of Nigeria, they listened to us. And I had the pleasure of traveling with him many times because I was not labeled in any political organization except the anti-apartheid movement. And so he could take me to Germany, to France, to Italy, to Spain, to Portugal, the United States, and the United Nations itself. Now, there were many things that we decided, of course. The UN Center Against Apartheid was set up in '84, unprecedented. That the UN should have a special secretariat that did nothing but fight apartheid. The first decision to set up the committee in November '62 was the first time that the United Nations had decided that it would fight apartheid, because not only was that committee established on the policies of apartheid, but it also agreed that the world must support sanctions. Later, we got more and more sanctions measures, and there isn't enough time to go through all of it. And then in 1970, we were at an international conference in Norway, and they decided the next one would be in Nigeria in 1977. When we went there, we had no Western leader, so I was able to persuade the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was a friend as well, and he decided to come 10 days before the general election in Norway to that conference in Nigeria. Whilst we were in Nigeria, we all heard a remarkable thing. The American Vela satellite went off its route, and it took pictures of South Africa preparing for a nuclear weapon test in the Kalahari. Then the French foreign minister and others wrote to South Africa and appealed that you should not detonate a nuclear weapon. Nigeria helped me to send a message back to the French government to say, and I had met the foreign minister 20, 30 times, and I had said, you always told us that your cooperation is for a peaceful nuclear cooperation. How is it now that you're warning them not to explode a bomb? And so it was decided at that conference by the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid, after I was given the privilege by the President of Nigeria to address that conference, which has never happened. I was only representing an individual and the anti-apartheid movement, no government. And then after I spoke, the Special Committee suggested to the UN that if I became the director, then they would set up the World Campaign Against Military and Nuclear Collaboration in Norway. And the Norwegian government, about to join the Security Council, said if I did that, then they would be prepared to pass on my reports to the Security Council. What I want to share with you, because there isn't much time, is that we were always a people's movement. I went to every Commonwealth except one for 20 years. And Julius Nyerere, with whom I worked very closely from the day when we formed the anti-apartheid movement or the boycott movement in '59, he offered to pay for my fares to the Commonwealth Conference. And I said, no, we are not going to take any money from any government, we'll raise it from the public. Because in the British anti-apartheid movement, many people would want to give us money. And remember, we were working in the Cold War. So if we took it from some countries, they would condemn us. So I always insisted that we would ask for our pennies and our shillings and our pounds. And the minute the public felt that the work we were doing was not useful, they wouldn't give us money. So in a way, to survive, we had to be relevant. And so we survived on public money, and that throughout our existence, and became, in the end, the most powerful solidarity movement in the world, coordinating solidarity movements in many parts of the world. But the two things we relied on, both for the World Campaign and the anti-apartheid movement, is never to give false information. I ask you, in 35 years, which government in the world has not given false information? I guarantee you there's not one. Yet we, in the anti-apartheid movement and the World Campaign, never gave false information, because we double-checked everything, knowing that if we were condemned by doing something wrong, then the United Nations, a special committee, everybody would have to write their hands off us, and the Western countries would be at our throats. So to have that record, which is an unprecedented record, the other important thing to remember is that we didn't work just by information and hearing things. We worked by what I can only call intuition. We judged and studied carefully, day and night, what the South African military machine and others would want. I wrote letters, I bought the big book of Jane's Defense Systems. You get volumes on every weapon system. We had to buy each one, they're very expensive. And I wrote to hundreds of them from Oslo to say there is an arms embargo by the Security Council. I hope you will not sell to South Africa this part and that part and that part. And we took all the parts of the Mirage plane and the tanks and so on. And there are sometimes thousands of parts in these tanks, so we wrote thousands of letters. The reason was we wanted letters on record, so that if they ever sold anything to South Africa, we could report to the Security Council that this country has violated the arms embargo. And indeed, I sent regular reports to the Arms Embargo Committee, and when they finished at the end of our liberation, they said they wouldn't have done any work if it hadn't been for my reports, but Thatcher and Reagan stopped that committee from doing much of its work, so we had to do it with the World Campaign. So friends, I want to end here by saying that there were also various attempts to give us false documents. I used to receive copies of so-called orders sent by South Africa to an American arms company, and the American company would write back to South Africa and say, we are going to supply you this part on this day in this manner. And they were false. So we couldn't use any information that just came. So we had to research it, and we didn't use it, and they never caught us on a single false allegation, although they sent many to us repeatedly in order to undermine us. So, friends, not to ever have been wrong, to have relied on intuition, we defeated the regime because of that. We knew what they were looking for, and we watched those areas, those weapon systems, those things that they would need for their own struggle. And of course, we worked together with Angola, Mozambique, the former Portuguese colonies, as they were called, and Zimbabwe. And soon after the anti-apartheid movement, please remember that our main task was to prevent a sellout to Ian Smith. So we couldn't just work on South Africa, we worked on Southern Africa as a whole. And the credibility and dignity we achieved made countries support us. I think, as the minister has said, there's no other country in the world that had a committee against it. Not one. Only South Africa. Now it's time for us to work on Palestine and to ensure that there's an arms embargo against Israel, because when South Africa said it gave up its nuclear weapons, I wrote a report for the United Nations to say that my own calculations about enriched uranium was such that South Africa will have made more than 6 weapons, and the 7th was in manufacture, and the others will have gone to Israel. We had many seminars and meetings with the Special Committee and the Center Against Apartheid on Israel. And I suggest that people look up those documents, because Israel and South Africa were the violators of the international arms embargo, and the nuclear capacity, which presents a great danger to world peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Minty. We will also be hearing reflections from Nelson Mufu, the resident coordinator of the United Nations in South Africa. It is important to note that this exhibition would not have been possible without the archival resources from the UN. Please help me welcome Nelson Mufu.
Thank you indeed, Program Director, for the kind introduction. And let me also start by acknowledging, of course, the chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation and former Minister Naledi Pandor, as well as the newly minted CEO. Permit me, former Minister, to stand on your protocol and not read through a list of all those who need to be acknowledged, but just to say it gives me great pleasure to be here amongst fellow ambassadors, high commissioners, heads of missions, as well as a wonderful engaged audience. It is really important that we acknowledge the work that the Mandela Foundation is doing in trying to ensure that the relentless spirit and enduring legacy of the former president is preserved, and that this is done as we also look at his contribution and the contribution of other heroes to the advocacy for liberation, which happened at and through the United Nations at certain times. And also, as we're here to launch an exhibition that reminds us of the journey that it took to get us here. My boss, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, recently affirmed that our world today is marred by war, overwhelmed by emergencies, blighted by racism, discrimination, poverty, and inequalities, and threatened by climate disaster. He went on to say, let us therefore find hope in Nelson Mandela's example and inspiration in his vision to do the right thing by humanity. It is therefore an enormous pleasure to join you all for this moment of history, the launch of this exhibition, which is really, as the former minister said, an illustration of shared humanity in action. Over the last week, the UN family has been celebrating 79 years of existence. Yesterday, in fact, at Durko, we were joined by Minister Lamola in the official commemoration of 30 years since South Africa rejoined the UN as part of its quest for democracy and social cohesion. United Nations mechanisms and officials have been a partner in the struggle against apartheid since the 1950 General Assembly resolution declaring that a policy of racial segregation, that is apartheid, is necessarily based on doctrines of racial discrimination. This inevitably led to the setting up of the special committee, and this really was guided not only by the UN Charter, but by the Declaration of Human Rights, which at its foundation is the quest for peace, prosperity, and development across the world. The Declaration's enduring power lies deeply in our shared values, transcending geopolitical and social divides, drawing instead on our deepest reflexes, solidarity, empathy, and connection. In fact, the last chair of the special committee, Professor Ibrahim Gambari from Nigeria, affirmed that in the quest for freedom and a transition to democracy, the United Nations cannot be a neutral bystander. We are all committed to give our full and concerted support to this critical process. And a decade after South Africa's transformation, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan also stated that when we remember the struggle against apartheid, we remember the struggle which galvanized the entire world community, bar some, that rallied people and governments behind a common objective, the objective of reaffirming the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms of all peoples. Today, the contribution of the Rainbow Nation to the multilateral quest for human rights, sustainable development, and peace and security is celebrated. In fact, Ora Tambo, whose 107 years birthday was celebrated a few days ago, engaged with the UN Special Committee and other structures, and one of the reflections he offered when he addressed the UN in 1982 was that the relentless pursuit for freedom should also serve as a contribution to the worldwide struggle for independence, democracy, social progress, and peace. Excellencies, dear friends, 30 years, therefore, into the democracy of South Africa, the United Nations is still here, committed to fighting for justice, to promoting human rights, and supporting the people of South Africa, the continent, and humanity in general. This exhibition is a testament of what we can accomplish when we work together, patiently, relentlessly, and intentionally. It represents the voices of the people, their determination, and tireless efforts towards building a more inclusive and compassionate society, rich in diversity, equal in dignity, and united in solidarity. And in my mind, it symbolizes a bridge between South Africa's past and future, honoring shared struggles and achievements while embracing common aspirations. The spirit of Ubuntu, resilience, and hope. As we reflect, we are also inspired by the lessons of the past and heed the unshakable call to do better today and in the future. 75 years following the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the urgency of combating discrimination and inequality remains. The urgency of working for the well-being of people and planet remains. Historical injustices are manifesting themselves in poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, discrimination, and social instability for entire communities and countries. During this time of a polycrisis, when problems seem intractable and discord reigns, we must return to our core values embodied in human rights to show us the route towards a more peaceful, inclusive, sustainable, and fair world. Last month, world leaders adopted the Pact for the Future at the Summit of the Future at the UN General Assembly. The Pact spells out clear commitments on sustainable development and financing, peace and security, digital cooperation, youth and future generations, and global governance. Above all, it also recognizes the need to reform the Security Council, to make it more representative, transparent, efficient, and accountable, to be able to deal with the intractable problems we're facing across the globe. As we move towards and together towards implementing this outcome from New York, we must remain anchored in our devotion to human rights and shared humanity, which is the cornerstone of multilateral cooperation. Allow me, as I move towards the conclusion, to echo the words of former President Mandela, who said, "Peace is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is the creation of an environment where all can flourish, regardless of race, color, creed, religion, gender, class, caste, or any other social markers of difference." Let us learn from history and be inspired to course correct by the experiences portrayed in this exhibition. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mufu. It is now time to hear from Zahir Laher, who is the Chief Director of the UN Political, Peace and Security at the Department of International Relations and Cooperations. He will be speaking on the ongoing relevance of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Good evening. The Chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation Board, my former boss, former Minister Naledi Pandor, the Chief Executive of the Foundation, I think I'll be saying my former boss again, Ambassador Abdul Minty, the UN Resident Coordinator Nelson Mufu, ambassadors, heads of mission accredited to South Africa, ladies and gentlemen. On 24th October, we commemorated the signing of the UN Charter 79 years ago. The Charter was signed at a time when the world was emerging from the traumatic effects of the Second World War And the founding of the organization was a commitment to work collaboratively to end conflict, to protect human rights, and to promote development, all under the umbrella of international law. The UN Charter represents the values of cooperative action to address global challenges. Today, however, the UN faces almost insurmountable challenges. Violations of its charter, the lack of global cooperation, the failure to implement the decisions that its various organ states are some of the challenges it faces. Despite these noble aims that it had set out to do, questions are being asked as to whether the UN is able to achieve what the Charter aspires. A recent report of Secretary General Antonio Guterres notes that there's an alarming increase of civilian casualties in armed conflict situations, as we see what is going on in Gaza, in Sudan, and other conflict situations. As member states of the UN, we have committed to work together to end war, yet clearly we have not succeeded. On development, we are lagging behind. We look at the record of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're falling far short of the aspirations that we had set ourselves. Human rights are being violated across the world in violation of the international instruments we have adopted to protect. Every day, we see violations of the Charter and human rights. Innocent people, including scores of children, are being killed and displaced. The UN's preamble has as the opening words to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And the question then is being asked often, is the UN still relevant? Does it need to exist? I mean, these are some of the questions we've all been soul-searching and thinking about. And I want to come back to that by firstly saying that I think I should have started off saying this, but I want to commend the Foundation for your work in putting together the excellent exhibition. And the exhibition illustrates how action through the UN can and should make a difference. So it's very easy to put up our hands and despair and be overwhelmed by disillusionment. You know, we can say, well, the international system is not working. What can we do? We are facing these challenges and there's very little we can do using the mechanisms we have. But the special committee that we've been learning about today is an example of perseverance and dedication, and most importantly, of collective action to fight an evil system. It was a committee largely driven by developing countries, countries of the South, supported by key partners from the developed world, working collectively using the multilateral system and organs of the UN to combat apartheid. So it's not a very different system to what we have today. The importance of countries of the South working together to address the challenges that face people of the South. The success of the work of the committee shows what is possible. The committee's work, of course, has been completed and it was disbanded. There are now calls for its resurrection, and we see evidence currently today of apartheid once again rearing its ugly head. A few years ago, it was almost taboo to mention apartheid in the context of the State of Israel. However, it's become clear, particularly through the excellent work of civil society organizations. And it's civil society organizations in Israel, in Palestine, and international civil society organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that have brought to the fore and have raised the issue of apartheid that is being perpetrated in Israel and the occupied territories. So as we look at these issues and we look at the fact that apartheid is being raised in the context of Israel, these questions then do persist. That do we need the committee again? Do we need the committee to be reformulated in the United Nations to address these same atrocities as we had seen in the time of apartheid South Africa? Yesterday, Minister Lamola mentioned in the event that Nelson spoke about, where we commemorated the signing of the UN Charter, and Minister Lamola mentioned apartheid in the context of South Africa, and he says, we as South Africans know apartheid. We see it and we know it. You may be aware that the International Court of Justice recently delivered an advisory opinion on the legality, or rather the illegality, of the Israeli occupation. And one of the findings of the opinion is that Israel had violated a number of articles in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the CERD, including Article 3. And Article 3 of the CERD, I'll remind you, states that State parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction. This is probably one of the strongest assertions by the ICJ in its advisory opinion, in the context of indicating that what is being committed in Israel, in the state of Israel, is apartheid. Last month, in September, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution ES 1024. That was an emergency special session held of the General Assembly. And this resolution essentially was about endorsing this advisory opinion. And operative paragraph 14 of this resolution requests the Secretary General, in consultation with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and member states with relevant experience and expertise, to present proposals in the report requested in the present resolution. So the resolution requests the Secretary General to prepare a report, and it requests member states and experts to look at the establishment of a mechanism to follow up on the violations of Israel of Article 3 of the CERT. So the question then is, as member states, as civil society, we have been given a challenge. We've been given a request by the General Assembly. Look at the mechanisms that you may be able to propose that will give meaning and to address the issues that have been raised by the ICJ, which is essentially the violations of Article 3 of the CERT. So it presents us an opportunity. It presents us an opportunity for us to consider setting up kinds of mechanisms akin to the special committee to look at racial discrimination being committed by the State of Israel. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is but one mechanism we as governments and civil society need to mobilize to address the challenges facing the people of Palestine. Yesterday, South Africa filed its memorial to the International Court of Justice in its application of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip. This is the South Africa versus Israel case at the ICJ. The memorial, as indicated in the statement that was issued by the government, contains evidence which shows how the government of Israel has violated the Genocide Convention and continues to ignore and defy several provisional measures of the ICJ. The evidence that our legal team have put together will show that undergirding Israel's genocidal acts is the special intent to commit genocide, a failure by Israel to prevent incitement to genocide, to prevent genocide itself, and its failure to punish those inciting and committing acts of genocide. The ICJ case is significant, but it will no doubt take months, if not years, before we get an outcome. In the meantime, we cannot sit back and rely on just this process. We need to take and explore other complementary actions and options, and one of which is the issue we've discussed today. I want to conclude by reiterating the words of His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa in his closing remarks at the Summit of the Future last month in New York, where he said, "Now is the time to recommit to adopting concrete actions to protect the needs and interests of present and future generations. Our failure will be a betrayal for future generations. We dare not fail." This was recalled by Minister Ronald Lamola yesterday at Durko at the UN commemoration, as he stressed and as he concluded his statement, we dare not fail. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of our program. And to conclude the formal program this evening, I would like to invite Rezia Saleh, Head of the Archives and Research Department here at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, to give the closing remarks and vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm following my CEO, Dr. Pando, all protocol observed. I'm also standing between you and food, so I'll be very brief. I hope that you've enjoyed the deliberations and reflections today. As we celebrate 30 years of our democracy, we do so with the realization that it did not come cheaply, that many people around the world rallied behind all freedom-loving South Africans and our vision for a better world, not just only for us, but for all of humanity. And the speakers today have reflected that in their reflection, in their deliberations. And the crystal clear message that has come out is a call for action. So in a sense, it feels like deja vu. What happened with the, with the resolutions at the UN and the vetoing? If you look at the exhibition, the failures of our humanity, you can see which countries do all the vetoing during apartheid South Africa and during apartheid Israel as well. Just before I start with my thank you, I would just like to acknowledge Mr. Inigo S. Reddy, who was the secretary of the Center Against Apartheid at the UN for the role that he played in highlighting and showcasing the anti-apartheid work that was done by the UN. And a lot of the research and the material that we drew on for the exhibition comes from Mr. Reddy's collection, both at JSTOR and here at the foundation. Mr. Reddy was a very prominent collector of records, and if you go to many archives around the world, you'll find Mr. Reddy's collection in those archives. So I'd like to thank our chair, Dr. Naledi Pandor, for so graciously accepting our invitation. Dr. Pandor so eloquently outlined the pillars of the South African struggle against apartheid and how that led to the demise of apartheid and how we need to follow up and the call to action. Also a special thanks to Ambassador Abdul Minty, whose long involvement in the anti-apartheid movement and in particular the global nuclear disarmament campaign was the perfect person to reflect on the role of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. I think he has a fountain of knowledge in his head, and I've asked him when is he writing his memoirs. He also told me that it will be his birthday in 2 days' time, so happy birthday, Ambassador Minty. I'm not going to disclose your age, but it's many generations. Nelson Mufu, thank you. Without you, the exhibition wouldn't have been possible because we drew a lot on the UN documentation, and thank you for your insights. To Zahir, special thank you for so ably standing in place for your Director General. We wish Zain Dango well. He's ill, so Zahir had to replace him at very last moment. Also, the staff of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, so competently led by our brand new CEO, Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, and everyone who was instrumental in making today's event a success. Thank you so much. A special mention to 2 interns who were here for about a month, a few months ago. And we really utilized their time to go through all those UN special committee reports and the UN General Assembly reports to stuff out everything. A lot of tedious work was done by Eva K. Probus and Slate Taylor. The dialogue and advocacy team, who Sumaya has already acknowledged, and the archive and research team, especially our wonderful program director, Sophia, big hand for her. And you, dear guests, for taking time out to come today to view the exhibition and to listen and to participate in this event. Thank you so much for taking your time. As I close this session, I invite you to join us for refreshments, networking, and socializing downstairs in our canteen. But I leave you with the words of Nelson Mandela, because we are the Nelson Mandela Foundation, who in 2002 said, we need to know with a fresh conviction that we all share a common humanity and that our diversity in the world is the strength for our future together. Thank you.